With the recent surprise release of Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition Switch 2 version, unnecessarily long name, I know, I decided to give the original Xenoblade Chronicles game another playthrough, and man, am I glad I did. However, this video isn't about the main story, rather I wanted to talk about its epilogue story, Future Connected, that was released alongside the original Definitive Edition release of the game back in May of 2020. Now, I remember picking this game back up in 2020, and I struggled to get through it because I was kind of lazy and I didn't feel like learning the combat. You know, it was COVID, I was tired from work, and I was really just wanting to play Animal Crossing. So, if I remember correctly, I think I got through it in about 40 hours or so due to me just ignoring the side content and exploration. And of course, I put the combat on casual mode because I could not be bothered to actually learn how to correctly equip proper gear and learn team synergy. So upon finishing the game back in 2020, I remember enjoying it quite a bit, not as much as Xenoblade 2, but I enjoyed it. And I guess because I didn't enjoy as much as Xenoblade 2, I kind of never got through to Future Connected. So this time around, I not only chose to play on standard combat and actually explore the map, do side quests, look for secret locations, do difficult optional stuff in the overworld such as enemies and side quests. But I actually decided to play Future Connected when I was done. And unsurprisingly, you know, this led to me having a much more enjoyable experience compared to the first time around. It also helped that the Switch 2 version added the Ether Jet, which made exploration so much easier, less time consuming. So between that and me actually engaging with the game a lot more, I really enjoy my time. Not as much as Xenoblade 2, that's still my favorite, or Xenoblade 3, but I really enjoyed the game. And by the time I was finished, I was like, dang, I really want to play some more Xenoblade, so I went ahead and I booted up Future Connected. Now, just coming off the high of finishing one of the best RPGs ever released, one of the best I've ever played, I was immensely excited for what additional story and lore would be made available to me in the epilogue. Now, I knew before going into this new epilogue that it was considered a little bit weaker than other Xenoblade games or DLCs, so I wasn't shocked to find that the epilogue wasn't able to send me to the extravagant heights, you know, of the other Xenoblade experiences that I've had, like 2 and 3 and Torna and the 3 DLC especially. However, the reasons as to why I didn't end up liking this as much as the other ones and why I didn't think it had the same kind of quality as the other games kind of surprised me. Now, before discussing the parts of the epilogue which disappointed me, I wanted to first begin by giving this additional content credit where it is due, because it was definitely still an enjoyable experience that, you know, hooked me in for the 7 hours or so that it took me to beat. Now, the first thing that I really enjoyed about this epilogue story, Future Connected, was the introduction of the 2 new playable characters, which, funny enough, are children of Ricky, that being Nene and Kino. The comedy that these 2 characters brought to the story beats was some of the funniest bits of dialogue that I've ever seen in gaming. And that's coming from someone who isn't exactly a fan of the Nopon characters and their humor. It's just never been something that really worked for me. Every now and then it'll get like a chuckle out of me, but for the most part it kind of just annoys me. You know, but Monolith Soft this time around took those characters that I didn't really like, and they ended up creating what may be 2 of my favorite characters in all of Xenoblade through sheer humor and also just the connection that Nene and Kino had, that they shared, was really sweet, something that I really connected with. You know, it's really just that Nopon and their unique way of speaking and their childish humor. It's just, it kind of threw off the tone of other Xenoblade games, but this time around, like, something about Nene and her flat lines of comedic delivery, I don't know, something about that just worked, that Ricky and, you know, the other Nopon throughout the various Xenoblade games just never really, you know, worked for me. Now, the gameplay, while almost identical to the base games, was slightly altered in the way that chain attacks are handled, but besides that, it's basically the same. So, gone are the days of strategically using your party members' various arts in order to defeat an enemy. Now, there are various Nopon expeditioners which you must seek out and recruit. And once enough of these Nopon are assembled, they become the replacement for the previous method of chain attacks. With each new Nopon found, the chain attack increases in power until all are eventually discovered. Now, chain attacks are now split into 3 different types. One focused on AoE and healing your party members / preventing debuffs. Another that's a single target high damage focus attack. And the last one being another AoE attack that results in the enemy being afflicted with the Daze effect. Now, this might seem like a downgrade compared to the previous system, and it kind of is, but I believe that this was the right call, considering the fact that we can only choose between 4 playable characters compared to the 7 found in the base game. And this change in gameplay was something that I enjoyed personally, even with the slight loss of strategy and player involvement during chain attacks, because going out and actually finding these Nopon and completing the quest in order to add them to your team felt rewarding, and it was also just fun seeking them out and just finding them throughout the environment. Chain attacks can be compared to the base game's method of just get better weapon, upgrade, character arts, and eventually do more damage. You still do that in here, but it also has another layer of seeking out these Nopon, which will in turn increase the maximum damage that you can do with your chain attack. So for this side story, I think it was the right call and it ended up working out. Now, onto the story bit, which is where I actually have some problems, but we'll get to the problems later. We'll talk about what I like first. In terms of story content, the idea of this additional story focusing on Melia, the fate of the Hyentia post, final events of the game, and the challenging relations between peoples of Mechonis and Bionis following the forced migration, Mechonis citizens to the Bionis after, their homeland was kind of eviscerated at the end of the game. Those all felt like plot points that were worthy of additional screen time and stuff that I wanted to see fleshed out, so I was glad to see them there. So that's the stuff that I like, but there is a lot of things in this DLC story-wise that kind of just threw me off, especially compared to the base game experience. First thing being the Fog King. Okay, when the Fog King, the antagonist of the story was introduced, I was instantly intrigued, as to what this mysterious enemy could be, what the origins of the rift in the sky and which it came from is going to be. As the story progressed, I kept waiting for further details to be revealed about the rift, the Fog King, the origins, but it just never came. And previous interest in the Xenoblade franchise maybe expected this abnormal rift in the sky would be connected to the, the awesome sci-fi lore elements that are contained within every other Xeno story. And, as each story progressed, I was waiting. Why it could create the Fog King, how it was affecting various monsters and turning them into Fog Beasts, and it just never came, which was super disappointing. And for me, this non-explanation of the rift and everything associated within the story of the epilogue was just kind of weird, especially, considering how other Xenoblade games handled why it's there. And it just never did, and it ended up being really weird because the characters just kind of never questioned it. They kind of just solved the story. They kind of just beat the Fog King, and then it was just like, wipe our hands clean of it. We're done. We did it. And just like, but where did it come from? Whatever. Xenoblade games have never been on the nose with their story and lore, but I can't remember another time where an important plot point like this one was just left unanswered and unexplained. And I actually ended up doing a bit of research online about this rift and where it came from, and apparently it actually does have some sort of connection to the, the sequels of 2 and 3, has a lore reason for its existing, but the connection is kind of murky, and you gotta have to read between the lines to understand it a bit, which, it does provide some closure for me. It makes me think like, oh, okay, it wasn't a complete waste to make the story about this rift and the Fog Beast and the Fog Monsters, Fog King. But that being said, I just do feel like it was I just need a bit more explanation as to the nature of the rift and why defeating the Fog King closes it. It would have gave me some closure during the game. As someone who isn't familiar with every single bit of lore in the Xenoblade series, if I had just known a little bit more about the rift, I probably would have accepted it a little bit more instead of being kind of annoyed at it. And before I was familiar with what the rift and the Fog King actually was, I felt that the story might have just benefited from a more grounded approach compared to, the incomplete story of the rift and the Fog King that we ended up getting. And as much as I love the sci-fi elements of Xenoblade games, I would have personally preferred the story to solely focus on the relationship struggles between the people of Bionis and Mechonis. If the sci-fi stuff that we did get, being the Rift and the Fog King, was going to end up being so murky. If it wasn't going to be explored properly, I would have just preferred seeing how the people of, Bionis and Mechonis moving on after the war, but instead we kind of got a split, which was, it's whatever. But this grounded approach, I think, probably would have helped to flesh out another new character that was introduced in the epilogue story by the name of Gaelgar. Gaelgar, he's just not a good character. Right off the bat, he just looks evil. His design literally just says, I'm a villain, and his dialogue and the way he speaks instantly just gives away that this guy's a villain. And I can excuse a character's introduction being simple, just them being a villain right off the bat, being, common knowledge. But what I couldn't excuse is just his backstory and his utilization within the story being mishandled so poorly. Right from the beginning, we learn that Gaelgar has some sort of agenda against High-Entia who aren't mixed with Homs, pure blood High-Entia, which results in him basically worshipping Melius, and she's the first empress to have a mixed bloodline. And, I think this is a very interesting conflict that could have led to some grander explorations of why he felt this way, and if there were possibly others who shared the same belief. But instead, his motivations were like instantly clear from the beginning. We knew exactly, what he believed in, and we knew that he was a villain straight off the bat. So there was no satisfying payoff as to why he held these racist beliefs, or there was no like, oh wait, he's a villain. We just knew he was gonna have this role from the beginning. And his involvement in the story was pretty minimal as well, and his actions didn't really have any serious effects on the plot or the characters besides, stalling them from achieving their goal. And if handled differently, I think the character of Gaelgar could have played an actual important role in the story instead of ending up, as a useless side villain with no real backstory. Instead of Gaelgar's motivations being obvious from the beginning, a more cunning villain could have convinced our heroes that he was there to help, integrating himself into the party in a way that could have, led to a slow reveal of his true motivations and backgrounds, which could have made the eventual revelation of his true intentions hit harder for both us and the party. But instead, Gaelgar's involvement in the plot feels like an annoying inconvenience instead of a real threat. And going from an amazing surprise antagonist from the base game and the character of Dixon to Gaelgar gave me just some serious whiplash, because I was just stunned when his plot came to an end, and then we just didn't see him again after the whole Teelan thing. And then I found out there's apparently a side quest where you confront him again, and he just jumps off a cliff and kills himself, and that's kind of it. Like, for Xenoblade and how strong their characters are and how well they're written, and just seeing that is so weird. It just feels rushed and just unfortunately mishandled. It sucks. It's unfortunate. I think just focusing on Gaelgar instead of the Rift could have helped flesh out why Gaelgar felt the way he did. And it would have been nice to know if Gaelgar was the only one who felt this way, if there was others. Imagine instead of, the confusing and shallow villains being Fog King and Gaelgar, we instead received the story focused on, maybe an emerging High-Entia civil war of sorts, or maybe additional focus on the rocky relationships that exist between Mechonis refugees and Bionis people. Now, I'm not saying I would have preferred the storyline. God knows I am nothing as a writer compared to, the Xenoblade team. I love and respect them and what they've done so much, but, I'm just saying the villains and storylines we end up getting in this particular epilogue just felt lackluster and incomplete compared to the base game and compared to other, Xenoblade entries, which, when it ended, it was unsatisfying, and it led to me imagining ways in which the story could have, played out in more satisfying ways, in which it could have been better, which is just something that never occurred for me in other Xenoblade games, because it was always very, very good, very satisfying, and I was just like, okay, that was really good, and then I just kind of moved on. But this time I was just like, really? That's it? Okay, I guess that was fun. ultimately, I did enjoy my time with the epilogue story of Future Connected, even if it lacked in certain areas. And and this new area of the Bonus was, really fun to explore, just like all the other Xenoblade areas. And the soundtrack being so beautiful, like always, and the gameplay being, great, like it always is. It kept me pushing through the story, even though I wasn't really fully invested in it. So, it may in fact be the weakest Xenoblade content I have experienced thus far, but even Xenoblade's weakest links are games worth experiencing, especially for those who are already fans of the series, like me. So, let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Did you enjoy Future Connected? Did you have similar issues? If you didn't, tell me why you liked it. But besides that, thank you for tuning in.